I'm here to talk to you today about women innovators in STEM you probably never heard of. I bet you heard of a couple of them today, but you might not know exactly why they're so famous and what they actually did other than being the first of something. So that's my gig today. I want to start off with a video, and this was an ad produced by Microsoft back in 2016 actually, about women inventors. Yeah, I like this ad. It sort of sets the context for why you see me up here talking about women you may never have heard of, because there's a lot. Just a little bit about me. I retired from Sandia Labs a few years back. I have degrees in mechanical and civil engineering. I'm a fellow of the Society of Women Engineers and was a recipient of their Distinguished Service Award as well. And part of that is because I've spent a lot of years doing a lot of outreach activities with young people, especially young women and underrepresented groups. And spending a lot of my retirement time, part of it in Santa Fe, in fact, trying to advocate for more and better STEM education. So that's my gig and why I'm here. I wanted to introduce you to 4 amazing women today, and they are innovators who changed the world, and in all in different ways. And now, if you probably haven't heard of them, but even if you have, and I'm sure at least one of these this group has, I'm going to try to elaborate a lot more about what they actually did. I'm currently involved in a project looking at wiki pages about some of these women and seeing, well, they're the first this or the first that, but it never says what they did. And so we're enhancing the wiki pages to try to make them more reflective of the accomplishments of these women. So hopefully when you leave here today, you will have also be able to do that about a number of women. We're going to begin with Grace Murray Hopper. I have another cute little video on her just to kind of introduce her here. Now, I think this film did a pretty good job of giving you an overview of her life and reminding you why she's so famous and why we call her Amazing Grace. And I want to give you a little deeper insight into that. First of all, I mean, she was obviously brilliant. She was a child prodigy of some sort, taking part of those clocks, right? And being so curious. She did enter Vassar, got her degree in math and physics, went on, got her MS from Yale in math, and was back teaching at Vassar while getting her PhD. And when she got her PhD, I did a little digging on this. Yale granted a 585 PhDs between 1931 and 1935. 10 of those were in math. 3 went to women. She was one of them. So it was pretty unusual in that time for a woman to get a PhD in math. I also want to point out how patriotic she was. They talked a little bit about her being in the Navy. Actually, she tried to join the Navy and they rejected her. And they rejected her because she was considered to be in an essential skill area for wartime, teaching math. And they also said she was underweight. She was too small. And she was just a small little woman. And so she's pretty smart cookie. So she decides, well, I'll just take a leave of absence from my teaching job. That'll fix that. And then she did have to get a bypass on the problem with her weight. So she did get into the Navy Reserve, the Waves. So from there, she did a whole bunch of other things. We're going to get into that in a minute. But I wanted to also point out, when she retired that first time, she was commander in the reserve. Second time, there were 3 times, by the way, that's not clear from the film. 72, she returned to active duty and was promoted to captain. And then shortly after that, in retirement, she was promoted to Commodore, which became the rank of Rear Admiral at a later date. So she served on and off for more than 40 years in the armed services, which I think is phenomenal for a woman of that day as well. And you heard the first time she retired, she was 60. I don't remember how old she was the 3rd time, but she was still doing a lot of stuff in her 70s and up to the time of her death. Let me go back and just review for a minute her early career. So when she was first put into the reserves, she got assigned to the Bureau of Ships computation project at Harvard. So couple of these pictures are from Harvard. And the Harvard Mark I, which is here, was it was the very first big computer that was put together. It is electromechanical in nature. I want you to understand, there was no digitization, there were no transistors. This thing ran on all these wires like this. This happens to be a different computer that we'll talk about in a minute, but it ran on vacuum tubes. That was the switching. It was vacuum tube switching. So when you say the Harvard Mark I, this entire room was filled with the Harvard Mark I. And that's something that people in younger generations don't quite grasp. Not only that, that probably your laptop, I'm sure your laptop on your desk has more computing power than this thing did. So lots has happened since then. Just that's how nascent the industry was when she first started working on computers. So from there, she went on to work on the Mark II and the UNIVAC. And it was around 1949, working on the Mark II, that she said, you know, I don't know why we don't program these things in natural language, English commands, and just let the computer translate it, and so that we are not sitting there working in machine code all the time, zeros and ones. And that was a hugely revolutionary thought for the time. This was her concept of a compiler, which is a normal thing for us now. But she said, I decided data processors, meaning people, by the way, ought to be able to write their own programs in English, and the computers would translate them. That was the beginning of COBOL in her mind, you know, the computer language for data processors in the business world primarily. So you go on from there, and I want to talk about, it wasn't for 3 years, by the way, before her colleagues actually, and she had a paper published on the topic, did they even think about using a compiler and creating a compiler for these machines. But here's the significance of that. It completely shaped the trajectory of computer science. The compilers actually increased productivity and efficiency. It allowed portability. If you had a code, you could take it to a compiler on any machine and use it on just about any machine. And it promoted the advancement of all kinds of languages. We talked about COBOL. Fortran was also invented in this time period for more scientific and R&D computing. So it was her unconventional idea that actually made computing accessible outside of this small circle of computer geeks, I guess you would say. And I think that's phenomenal all by itself. Who knows how long it would have been if Grace hadn't been around to promote these things. So in my mind, she's just a great example of resilience and persistence and service to the nation, and deserves all kinds of accolades for more than just being an 80-year-old admiral and being a cute little old lady and working with computers. So hopefully that gives you a little better idea of what she actually did with computers that made it so mind-blowing and so significant in today's world. Now our next woman, I'm changing gears a little bit, this is Dorothy Horstman. Now she was born in Spokane but grew up in San Francisco. She got an undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley, and then she went to medical school in San Francisco, UCSF. At that time, by the way, there were only about 5% of women graduating in the medical schools. So very much in the minority, definitely experienced some form of discrimination at the time. She became really interested in infectious diseases, and in particularly polio, because there were a lot of outbreaks at that time, and she treated a lot of polio kids in San Francisco General during her residency. And then she finished that residency and applied to Vanderbilt. Now there's a very interesting story behind this. The first time she applied, she was turned down, flat out. She assumed because she was a woman. So she resubmitted her resume under D.M. Horstman. Was hired sight unseen, showed up at Vanderbilt, and the director was absolutely flabbergasted, but he needed someone right away with her specific skills, and it would be pretty embarrassing to tell her to pack up and go back home to San Francisco. So they kept her. They allowed her to stay. And so she finished her residency at Vanderbilt. Then she got hired by Yale. So that was a whole nother chapter then we're going to talk about. In that job, we'll talk about that in a minute. The first thing I want to talk about is polio and how she got imbued in that. There's a book written by a lady named Lynn Cullen it's a novel, so it's a historical fiction book, but it's called Woman with the Cure, and it's where I got my idea for talking about Dorothy Horseman. But she gave a radio interview about a year ago, March, and talked about Dorothy quite a bit. Yeah, so there's a couple of things there we're going to get back to. Both that last bit about her, basically we avoided like a couple of years of trials in the United States because of the data she brought back from Russia. And we're going to talk more about that connection between finding the pathway and being able to get to the vaccine. I want to step back just a minute to her early career. When she was hired at Yale, she worked for Dr. John Paul, this gentleman right here, and her job was to go out to active polio outbreaks and collect blood samples, fecal samples, water samples from the environment and so on, because they were trying everything we could think of to figure out where does this disease come from and how does it spread. And she would bring them back to the lab and then do research. And in between times, she was still looking for how the idea that the virus traveled through the blood, working with monkeys and so on. But there's one thing I want you to notice about both of these pictures. She's a very statuesque woman. You notice she's taller than both of these gentlemen in the front row, and she's pretty tall. You can see a pretty tall woman looking there. She was in fact 6'1", according to Lynn Cullen in her book, and a striking woman. So people often commented on her height. So finally, she finds this pathway of polio. One of her monkeys that was injected became ill, but before she became ill, they had taken a blood sample and found the polio in her bloodstream. So you heard Lynn Cullen describe that whole thing about how people didn't believe her, and it took her a lot of years of breaking through to this barrier, partly because she was working on all these polio outbreaks, and partly because it was really hard for women to get funding in those days. But in addition, working independently, Dr. David Bodian at Johns Hopkins also found this pathway. And, he had better funding than her for one thing, and bigger staff. But they went to this immunology conference in New York in 1952. She spoke first and announced her findings. Dr. David Bodian went after her, announced the similar findings. They gave a joint press conference, and Lynn Cullen comments in one of her books that it was as though they had staged this picture as a secretary taking dictation. And so hold that thought for a minute, because we're going to talk more about that. Her later career and accomplishments, she actually did quite a bit. She became the first woman chair in a medical school at Yale, and she was a very well-known pediatrician, epidemiologist, virologist. In '61, she was named the first female professor and later the endowed chair of epidemiology. So it's not like she didn't get any kudos. But I want to point out one thing. This is the Polio Hall of Fame in Warm Springs, Georgia. She's not there. Dr. David Bodian is there. Somebody from his staff, another woman, Isabel Morgan, I think is her name, she's on there, but no Dorothy. And so that's really interesting, because if she had not made that discovery, and if Bodian had not made it jointly, they would have spent a lot more time trying to figure out how to massage those two vaccines to, if you don't even know how a disease happens, it's pretty hard to develop a vaccine that makes sense. So I always thought she got a little bit shafted on that when I read that. Stephanie Pollack is the next woman that we're going to talk about. She had quite an interesting discovery that has had a pretty profound impact. And we're going to hear a little bit about her. This is from the PBS NewsHour last March, actually. They were doing profiles on little-known women in history. So thanks for that. I know it feels like I'm letting other people do my work here, but it actually turns out it's fun to hear from this person herself, in my mind anyway. But I do want to point out a few things. There were several things that struck me when I read about her story and listened to her own story. First of all, she had said she had multiple job offers. I don't know any women senior women in the Society of Women Engineers who said that they got multiple offers. Most of them said they were underemployed or couldn't get jobs. And so this surprised the heck out of me. There must have been a real shortage of people in her area. And on top of that, she got the job when she was, all these men were coming back from war since 1946. And all these women were being displaced from the workplace. All the Rosie Riveters were being sent home. But I guess because of the field that she was in and the acute need for chemists, she got a job right off the bat when men were returning home and displacing women. So that was sort of interesting to me. And the other interesting story is that she got her job on the spot. She went in for this interview, and the guy interviewed her, and then he said, we'll get back with you in a couple of weeks. She said, but I have other offers I need to get back to people on. I must have been impressed because he called the secretary in and dictated her offer letter right there in front of her. So they hired her on the spot. And that also, to me, was amazing for a woman in 1946. She was either extraordinarily lucky or just the right place at the right time. I want to talk a little bit more about her career timeline. The first thing I want to point out, first of all, this is just her early stuff. And she started DuPont in 46. In 1950, that group moved to Wilmington, Delaware, which is where most people are familiar with the headquarters of DuPont, in this big R&D group. So she had a plum assignment. No wonder she got, just threw medical school out the window. But she was working for some 10 years before DuPont got into this family of polymers that developed Nomex, which you heard mentioned on the film. And Nomex is what they make firefighters' uniforms and race car drivers' uniforms out of. It's fire resistant, but it doesn't have the strength that they would like for other applications. So 65 is when she discovered Kevlar. But I want you to notice a couple things. Nomex was discovered in 60. It took 7 years to develop, pardon me. And Kevlar invented in 65, but was not really being produced in quantity until 71. There's a lot of manufacturing development that has to go on after an R&D discovery like that. Some people don't really understand, there's a long timeline there. And finally, there's a story about the gentleman that she spoke to not long after Kevlar was invented. He said, can you spare a little bit of this cloth? I want to do some tests to see if it'll make a bulletproof vest. So the bulletproof vest was not uniquely her idea, it was one of her colleagues. But of course she accommodated him, and the results were spectacular, as we're going to see in a minute. And then she continued to work, continued to look for new fibers, finally retired from 1986, still consulted after that. So this is she devoted her entire life at the one company and had this one giant, really important discovery, among others. 28 patents, that's a lot. Because Kevlar Kevlar vests particularly have turned out to be so impactful, I wanted to say a few more words about that. Now you heard, it is the most famous product that was produced from Kevlar, and many others that you heard in the beginning of the film. It was Dr. Joe Rivers, the gentleman that had that idea, as I mentioned before. The National Institute of Justice decided to do some testing on Kevlar before it became mass-produced. And what they found was that you could stop bullets from quite a few different types of guns, and the armor ensured a 95% probability of being hit with a 38 caliber bullet at 800 feet per second. They also said the probability of requiring surgery after being hit by such a projectile was 10% or less. Most people may or may not, well, I don't know who knows this, but I didn't until I read more about it. You can actually be injured pretty much, pretty hard by being hit by a bullet that's stopped by a Kevlar vest. You're going to bruise at a minimum, and you can be knocked out, and you might crack a rib, who knows. So you might, if you damage any of your internal organs, they might have to do surgery. But at least you're alive, and at least they're not trying to take pieces of your organ and put it back together. It's a much less invasive and less serious surgery if you survive being hit with a Kevlar vest on. So I'm trying to get you to understand this is a huge deal. Kevlar vests are a huge deal in our society. and in our lives in general. She did, like all of these other women we're talking about, get lots of awards. You heard about a couple of them, all kinds of medals and so on. Nobody ever got a Nobel, by the way, for the invention of Kevlar or anything like it, including her. But she left a great legacy. She did all kinds of lecturing. You heard about what she did, bringing students along and so on. That seems to be a pattern with the women that we're talking about here. And so that brings us to our final woman, Ellen Ochoa. I suspect almost everybody in this room has heard of Ellen, partly because she was the first Hispanic woman to go into space. But I'm going to give you a little broader context to consider what she's about and what she's done that's contributed to society. I picked her because she actually came through New Mexico when she worked at Sandia Labs for some years. So we have a little bit of claim to her. I also think it's inspirational that she grew up in the San Diego area with parents, grandparents who from Sonora, who didn't go to college, didn't have an education. So she's a real success story in terms of, I venture to say, some of the kids that you all work with. And, that anything is possible, that kind of theme goes on here. Another little timeline, just to give you some perspective. She was born 2 years later than me, grew up in the San Diego area, went to San Diego State, got a degree in physics, was Phi Beta Kappa, of course, she was brilliant. But she also went to Stanford. She got a PhD in electrical engineering. I think a lot of people probably missed that fact about her. I think I read that she was influenced a lot by one of the other earlier astronauts, Bonnie Dunbar, maybe, that she'd seen at Stanford. I have to look it up. But she went on to go on shuttle missions. These are the things that most people know her for. 93, 94, 99, 02. But then she became the director of the Johnson Space Center for 6 years, was the vice chair of the National Science Board, and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom fairly recently. So she is known not just for being in space, but for a lot of other things. She actually designed, her specialty in EE was optical systems, and she designed systems that allowed, we're going to talk about that in a minute here, I think. Let's see. So she had 3 patents, and she designed optical detection of defects in materials. Do you think that might be helpful on looking at the outside of a spacecraft when you're inside, so you don't have to send someone out on a spacewalk to diagnose a problem? and so that's impactful, right? That's impactful to the space program. And also, it sounds like, not off the tongue, Josh was the director of Johnson Space Center. Johnson Space Center controls all the flights, in the past from Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, Apollo-Soyuz, all the way through the current programs. And the director's responsible not just for the flights, she's responsible for all the scientists, engineers, astronauts, and the successes of the mission overall. So that was a big deal that she was the director of Johnson Space Center. That maybe kind of falls through, in my mind, that I didn't know that until I looked this up. That kind of fell through the cracks a little bit. And the other thing about her is that she also continues to encourage young women in STEM. There's just all kinds of cool stuff that she has done. One of them is she wrote a bilingual little book called We Are All Scientists, Todos Somos Científicos. And you can see it's a board book. It's for early elementary, which is very unique in the STEM identity area, in my mind anyway. I haven't seen a lot of things for this age group, but you're welcome to come up and look at this afterwards. So that was just kind of cool. And that she's doing things she can do to help raise us all up, and raise these kids up, and give them a STEM identity that a lot of kids in our state aren't getting, in my mind, right now. So I just want to say, look, we all owe thanks, big thanks, to these women in STEM. They have done amazing things. I choose these particular women for the commonalities they had in the fact that what they did in their time was unusual and amazing. For the fact they were firsts in a lot of instances, so they were pioneers. The important part is that they were pioneers in what they did. And from there, the fact that they all gave back after they retired, I mean, at all their lives, but also even all the way into retirement, practically till the day she died, she was giving back. She was one of the founders of Society of Women Engineers in 1950, by the way. And so I just think that these women probably earned a lot more recognition than they get typically from in the annals of history. And that goes back to the original ad that we saw from Microsoft, where young women can't name women inventors. Why is that? Well, it's societal, it's this, it's that, but it's something we can start working on. So that's my mission, and thanks for listening. I really appreciate you all being here today, and I will be around a little bit longer, and we're going to be in here for another half hour and out at our table after that, so feel free to come by and say hi. Thanks.